On July 28th of 1914, exactly 1 month following the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Empire of Austria-Hungary declared war upon Serbia. Russia, the self-named protector of the Orthodox and Slavic world, would mobilize its armies in support of Serbia, bringing much alarm to the Austrians. But fortunately for them, their ally of Germany, eager to flex their might as Europe's greatest land power, would declare war upon Russia and later Russia's ally of France, who had been historically hostile to Germany and made its position of neutrality in the conflict unclear. Finally, Germany's invasion of Belgium, a neutral border state between itself and France, would bring the United Kingdom into the war, locking Europe's 5 greatest powers into what would become the most devastating conflict on the continent yet. But only a few months into the contest, it appeared civility still rang strong on the battlefield. Momentary truces were regularly conducted between sides for purposes of recovering the dead, mutual rest, and sheltering from especially bad weather. European wars of previous decades tended to be formal and well coordinated with very specific terms of engagement. This, paired with a general courtesy and similar moral values, led to some rather unique interactions during the early fighting. See, few expected the war to last very long, and outside of Austria there was little motivation at the civilian level to fight what was originally seen as a secondary front to a primarily Austrian conflict. However, in the higher levels of command, it was better understood the stakes involved in the matter, and how little this actually had to do with Austria and Serbia's dispute. To quickly summarize the overarching situation, Germany at the time was emerging as Europe's new continental land power, a position previously held by France and one which Russia attempted but failed to assume following the Napoleonic Wars. Britain, through clever strategizing, was able to keep its major rivals on the continent preoccupied, not aggressive, and handicapped. The British, being a world-sprawling naval power, didn't so much care to control the European continent as France or Russia might have, but rather Britain sought to prevent an overwhelming force from rising on the continent and challenging their global naval supremacy. With Russia crippled in the Crimean War and France now beginning to open up to Britain as an ally instead of an enemy, it appeared as though the great threats of the East and West were suppressed. But between them rose a new opponent whose advancement and ambition proved more threatening than any rival prior: Germany. Like France before it, Germany sought to assume continental dominance and break the chains of Britain's global control once and for all. This, of course, worried the new Franco-British Entente, especially as the Germans began forging alliances throughout Central Europe, chiefly with Austria-Hungary and Italy. Russia, realizing Germany had quickly outpaced it economically and technologically, would find itself brought into alliance with France so that if Germany so much as attempted to attack Russia, it could not do so without drawing France into the fight and beginning a two-front war. The Germans considered this and determined that given Russia's poor leadership and lack of development, it would be possible to defeat both France and Russia under the proper circumstances, and Austria's war with Serbia offered just the right opportunity. With Austria guaranteed as an ally to fight against Russia, and the Russians not yet prepared for war, Germany could launch a speedy invasion of France, capture Paris, circle around before Russia could advance very far, and crush the Russian army under the full weight of the German military. A quick side conflict to reassert its dominance and fracture the Franco-Russian alliance. Now that's all well and good, but this likely didn't come to mind for the average citizen of the time. Remember that for nearly every country involved, this isn't expressly a war for the purpose of expansion or to repel a foreign invasion of their own land. Officially, the Russians are fighting to help Serbia, the Germans are fighting the French and Russians to help Austria, and the British are fighting in defense of Belgium, who just happened to get caught between France and Germany. Only Austria and Serbia officially have personal issues at stake. The Austrians see the Serbs as enabling a terrorist organization which has just assassinated their heir to the throne, and the Serbs, now being under invasion, see the Austrians as a threat to South Slavic sovereignty. So if you're a soldier belonging to any of the other nations and you're not familiar with the bigger geopolitical game, chances are you aren't very invested in that dispute and the war as a whole. We get a picture of this from a handful of early accounts, talks of exhaustion with war and a lack of understanding what exactly was being fought for. Sure, it's something you might look past if you expect the fighting to end in a matter of weeks, but now, come December, over 100 days into the conflict, the heat of war cools down just a bit. Soldiers start to think more about their families back home and of Christmas. Thus, minor unsanctioned interactions began. A little more talking, longer ceasefires, even trading of rations, and it all came to a head on the morning of Christmas Day. Festivities had been underway in the trenches since at least the prior night. Carols were sung, ragtag decorations were hung, and some even managed to set up their own Christmas trees. All things the opposite side would typically see or hear, and which they, in turn, would reciprocate. But come morning, and seemingly without coordination of any kind, thousands of soldiers across the Western Front began emerging from their trenches shouting Merry Christmas in English, German, and French. Their opponents, though skeptical at first, would soon join them, and for several what followed was a day, and in some instances days, of merriment, gift-giving, soccer playing, and general friendly activity. This phenomenon was not exclusive to the Western Front either. Though the Orthodox countries of Russia and Serbia followed a different calendar than the Western countries, the holiday itself still wasn't too far off, and once it arrived in the West, even members of the Austrian command encouraged a ceasefire wherever convenient, ordering that no shots be taken unless the Russians initiated combat. In one instance, the Russians who had previously been besieging an Austrian stronghold instead left at their gates 3 Christmas trees along with a note which read, quote, "We wish you a Merry Christmas and hope we can come to a peaceful agreement as soon as possible." But while the Eastern Theater saw support for the ceasefires from at least some members of military command, in the West, be it among the Germans, French, or British, there was a terrible aversion to their men becoming what one commander described as too familiar with the enemy. How, after all, did they expect soldiers to fire upon men whom just hours ago had been the kindest of friends to them? This was bad for the greater game. The fighting had to continue, and the truce had to be crushed. Commanders ordered their men back into action at risk of treason charges. Artillery was fired from one side in order to force a retaliation by the other. Soldiers who participated in the ceasefire were rotated away from the front lines, and news of the truce was heavily suppressed across every country, done so to prevent word from spreading and remaining soldiers from ceasing conflicts as well. As far as many of the participants knew, they alone had been the only ones to call for a ceasefire, not realizing just how widespread this desire for even a momentary peace had been. But by the time news finally broke, the fighting had resumed, and all further attempts for future holiday truces were abandoned, even despite major support from figures as significant as the Pope. But what if that changed? What if in an alternate timeline, the Christmas truce ended World War I? Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to thank today's generous sponsor, Ridge Wallet, for helping us make this video possible. Ridge Wallets are a sleek and durable alternative to the bulky leather wallet you're probably carrying around. At half the size of an average wallet without compromising your ability to carry several cards and plenty of cash, there's few reasons not to buy one of these while you still can. And if you order now by going to ridge.com/MonsierZ and use promo code MonsierZ at checkout, you'll get 10% off and free worldwide shipping and returns. Be sure to check out the link in the description, and remember to have a very Merry Christmas. Now, back to the video. Despite the seemingly fantastic nature of a holiday event bringing an end to one of history's most devastating conflicts, it's not as far-fetched as you might think. As we mentioned earlier, there was a general disinterest in the war from the get-go, a sense that by the end of summer it had already dragged on as long as it needed to. Consider that by this point the Germans and French had already reached a stalemate, one which would go on to last almost 3 more years, mind you, during which time little ground would be taken and several lives would be lost, and all for a larger geopolitical play many of these men couldn't see. Imagine then how much might have changed had stories of the truce spread further throughout the battlefields and back home, if such was enough to convince only a fraction of commanding officers to end the senseless violence, to keep the artillery silent, if word had reached enough men that no amount of troop rotations could restart the fighting and a cohesive demand could be made to finally end the war. What this all comes down to is a willingness among the leaders of each country to cease the fighting under the current conditions and resume pursuing the greater game for power in future wars instead. Though Britain had only entered the war on Belgium's behalf, it had from the very beginning had every intention of assisting France against Germany regardless, though that being said, an already quite large anti-war faction did then exist in Britain's government, and given just a bit more sway from the Christmas truce movement, it's not at all difficult to imagine Britain withdrawing from the conflict on the condition that Germany withdraw from France and Belgium. Germany seemingly had the most to gain from the war, however. As we mentioned earlier, conditions were just right for the Germans to wipe out their neighboring threats, and such an opportunity might not present itself again. In our timeline, the Great War appeared to favor the Germans early on, and if Germany sensed that it was on track to win, there's even less incentive to withdraw. For that reason, an insurrection from the public and sympathetic soldiers might be necessary to finally coax Germany into peace. Again, there's little they can do if a majority of their men refuse to fight a fruitless war, seemingly only for Austria's sake. In the East, things would take a bit more time. The animosity between Germany, Russia, and Austria had not been quite as fierce as it was between the French, British, and Germans. The Eastern royals had, after all, come together on various occasions in the past, not to mention the German Emperor and Russian Tsar happened to be cousins who kept in good contact with one another. But what complicates the Eastern Front is the recent entry of the non-Christian Ottoman Empire into the war, as well as Austria's remaining gripe with the Serbians. Though unlikely to initiate a Christmas truce, it's important to remember that by this point the Ottomans were no longer the great power they once were, and had gradually become dependent upon Germany and other great powers to protect them from, well, the other great powers. The Ottoman Turks held lands desired by France, Russia, and Britain, not to mention a number of secondary powers like Italy, Greece, and Bulgaria. However, none of the great powers wished for any of the others to gain an upper hand in the region, and so a fragile balance was achieved, with Germany soon becoming the Ottoman Empire's chief ally, holding few ambitions in Turkish lands but being positioned well enough to challenge any of their major threats in Europe. Because of its dependency upon Germany, the Ottomans can be expected to follow along with Germany's withdrawal to avoid becoming a target for Russian or British retaliation. As for the Serbian dispute, this would become a major matter of discussion between Austria and Russia. In our timeline, Austria had issued an ultimatum to Serbia which demanded they condemn the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, along with the pan-Yugoslav movements responsible, as well as allow Austria to actively investigate their military and government for terrorist sympathizers to be arrested immediately. Just prior to the war, Russia encouraged Serbia to accept the terms, knowing that it could not sustain a war against Germany if they were to get involved. Given a second opportunity for peace, Russia would again side with Austria in demanding Serbia concede for the sake of European peace, leaving the Serbians to become a proxy of Austria's empire. With that, the Great War would have come to a close before it ever became a Great War. The Austro-Serbian War, as it might instead come to be known, would end just a few weeks after the Christmas truce, allowing soldiers to return home where the celebrations would continue. Unbeknownst to them, millions of lives would have just been saved, their cities spared the destruction seen in our timeline, and for Russia, Germany, Austria, and Turkey, their empires narrowly escaped the collapse they would have otherwise faced under the weight of years of arduous combat. For most intents and purposes, the Great War essentially never happened, but some major changes do occur. Beginning with the empires which would have collapsed in our timeline, a surviving Austro-Hungarian empire would be free to continue pursuing a solution to the division within its lands and prevent future conflicts with the neighboring Slavic countries. Archduke Franz Ferdinand had, prior to his assassination, proposed a reorganization of the empire into a United States of Austria, granting equal representation and regional autonomy to all ethnic groups within the empire. However, as the now late Ferdinand was the primary advocate of this reform, a previously more popular alternative would likely be taken up, the creation of a third crown. Austro-Hungary, as you might imagine, was a dual monarchy in which Austria and Hungary were mostly independent from one another but shared a monarch, and while this appeased about 2/4 of the total population, nearly the entire remaining half, the Slavs, held no autonomy of their own. The Slavs, divided between the two Western and Southern Slavic cultures, debated over whether Bohemia or Croatia should be granted the right to represent this third group, and it was ultimately decided by Austria that Croatia was better suited for the role. However, the creation of a third kingdom would demand land concession from Hungary, who remained uncooperative until in our timeline the war finally ended and the empire collapsed. Desperate to achieve stability within the empire, the Austro-Hungarian emperor would resolve to create the third crown regardless of Hungarian resistance, possibly sowing the seeds for Hungarian secession in the future. The empire of the Ottomans would not be utterly torn to shreds as it had been by the Western powers in our timeline. However, there would still be a great burden hanging over the empire's head. The Turks were no longer a force on par with those of Europe and could no longer pretend that they were. The only hope for Ottoman prosperity and survival was to focus fully on becoming a regional power around which its neighbors would spin, and to distance itself from European affairs in the Mediterranean and the Balkans. The Turks would reaffirm their hold over the lands of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria, and attempt to forge out of Arabia a powerful ally by investing in the sympathetic Arabian Emirate of Jabal Shammar against the British-backed House of Saud, the originator of today's Saudi Arabia. Russia would not face the hardships brought on by the war, and thus the momentum which would have fueled the overthrow of the Tsar and the following Bolshevik Revolution are lost. Tsar Nicholas II is given more time to learn what it takes to be a proper leader, but whether or not he's successful is up for debate. What should be taken away from this, however, is that it is now highly unlikely for communism to take root in Eastern Europe, and without the disillusionment which followed the Great War of our timeline, there's no incentive for it to rise elsewhere either. The same goes for Germany, where the monarchy is likely to remain in place, though if we assume a rebellion of sorts was necessary to bring an end to the war, Kaiser Wilhelm would now find himself reduced of power, sharing it with a parliament, though still remain as head of Germany. Without the hefty economic penalties, loss of life, and physical destruction of a prolonged war, Germany remains far more stable and never sees the rise of National Socialism. France and Britain would remain allied in the event Germany becomes a threat in the future, though gradually the British would return to their policy of splendid isolation, focusing primarily on developing and expanding their colonies and leaving the German issue for France to resolve. France, now in Britain's good graces, would benefit greatly from an emerging trade partnership, which would enrich the French and leave them better able to deal with the Germans in the future. Certainly, war would not be done away with for all times, and colonial ambitions are likely to heat up again in China, which would have found itself destabilized midway through the Great War period. However, it can be said that crisis, for the moment, had been averted. A continent spared a conflict which would have bred decades of chaos and further destruction, and all it would have taken was a bit more goodwill between brothers and a willingness to remember the true meaning of Christmas. The US of Z thanks you for watching. Support your legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.